See that band all dressed in white.
The Hebrew word most relevant to this discussion is eved. This word has historically been translated in English as either slave or servant. In English, most of us recognize a very different inference from which word we choose to use. The word slave connotes an individual who is dishonored at the hands of another, is denied some or all of their rights, and who labors without compensation. On the other hand, servant does not go this far. To be a servant is more akin to being an employee. A servant has compensation. They have rights that are respected, and their status is a voluntary contract. Yet, with regards to the Old Testament, both of these words point back to eved. Here is where I want to make a proposition. Where in English we see slavery and servitude as two different things, the ancient Israelite perceived these things on a continuum. Slavery and servitude both fall under the broader concept of avadim, one being an appropriate way to administer avadim, and the other being an inappropriate way to administer it. Prior to the revealing of the Mosaic Law, Scripture gives us examples of each. In Genesis chapter 26, verse 24, God describes Abraham as his eved. Abraham's relationship to God was one of covenantal faithfulness. God took care of Abraham and promised to prosper him and his lineage. The relationship of Abraham to God is an appropriate display of avadim. Thus, most English translations have rendered this passage as "my servant Abraham," not "my slave Abraham." In a purely grammatical sense, either rendering is appropriate. But, in terms of the broader context, servant is the right choice because it accurately reflects God and Abraham's relationship. Abraham's participation in covenant relationship with God was voluntary. It was reflective of love, respect, and adoration. God reciprocated Abraham's faithfulness with covenantal blessing and daily providence. On the other hand, when the Hebrews were in Egypt, they were also avadim. God himself declares over and over again that he brought Israel, quote, out of the house of avadim. Yet, as we've already seen, the example set by Egypt was an inappropriate administration of avadim. It was one of abuse, hardship, and fear, where individual rights were not respected, nor were people compensated for their labors. Even though the Hebrew wording is the same, it is not appropriate here to translate avadim as mere service. It was slavery. It is this example that God calls Israel to remember in the giving of the Torah, so that they would administer avadim as proper and legal service, rather than illegal and abusive slavery. Thus, the Mosaic laws are not about the sanction of slavery. They are about the sanction of servitude.
Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only of servanthood.
To those who think slavery founded in Scripture, a careful and attentive perusal of the sacred writings would contribute more than anything to eradicate the error. They will not find even the name of slave once mentioned therein, and applied to a servitude to be continued from parent to child in perpetuity, with approbation. The term used on the occasion in the sacred text is servant, and upon a fair construction of those writings, there is no necessity, nor can the service, consistent with the whole tenor of Scripture, be extended further than the generation spoken of. It was never intended to include the posterity.
The economic systems of the ancient world were, for the most part, non-monetary. They did not have the use of money or currency. The further back you go in history, the more true this becomes. Even in New Testament times, not everyone in the Roman world had minted coins in their pockets. For most people, especially those of lower economic strata or those who live outside of metropolitan areas, their economic exchanges were based in barter and trade, the pure exchange of goods and services for other goods or services. This economic situation was true for infant Israel in the late Bronze Age. They were not a cash economy. To participate in the economy of the nation, you needed to have goods or services to offer. The poor in Israel, like the poor everywhere else, lacked goods to trade. Thus, to acquire wealth, The ancient Israelite had the option to volunteer themselves into a servile relationship to a more wealthy person, a quote-unquote master. The master owned the servant's labor and the products thereof. In response, the master provided the servant with a living situation and daily sustenance, perhaps even a familial inheritance if the master died. The terms of these relationships were contractually established and could not be legally imposed by the master beyond the bounds of said contract. This economic strategy is called debt service or indentured service. It is a far cry from chattel slavery, which was the backbone of the American South and the pagan Roman world of the first century.
Hebrew debt servanthood could be compared to similar conditions in colonial America. Paying fares for passage to America was too costly for many individuals to afford. So they'd contract themselves out, working in the households, often in apprentice-like positions, until they paid back their debts. 1/2 to 2/3 of white immigrants to Britain's colonies were indentured servants. Likewise, an Israelite strapped for shekels might become an indentured servant to pay off his debt to a boss or employer. Calling him a master is often way too strong a term, just as the term abed, servant, employee, typically shouldn't be translated as slave. Even when the terms buy, sell, or acquire are used of servants' employees, they don't mean the person in question is just property. Think of a sports player today who gets traded to another team to which he belongs. Yes, teams have owners, but we're hardly talking about slavery here. Rather, these are formal contractual agreements, which is what we find in Old Testament servanthood employee arrangements. This servanthood wasn't much different experientially from paid employment in a cash economy like ours.
Further, the ancient world was pre-industrial. The people did not live in modern homes that are built to withstand wind and rain. They did not have electric power. They did not have cars to get around, and they did not have fully stocked supermarkets they could purchase goods from at their convenience. This means that the ancient world, of which Israel was a part, had a different value system than we do today. Our industry has freed us to pursue our individual passions and goals. In the ancient world, one did not have nearly as many safety nets. If you struck out on your own, you might die. If you could contract yourself into an arrangement where food, shelter, and protection were somewhat expected, it gave you an exponentially better chance at survival. For the poor Israelite, whether a native or a sojourner, this was what they were more interested in. Christian proponents of slavery in America, whether during the colonial years or in the independent union prior to the Civil War, did not have full access to these understandings of the ancient world. Egyptian hieroglyphs were only first deciphered in 1822. Likewise, the cuneiform script of the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia was not fully deciphered until 1857. It's only been in these last roughly 200 years that we have been able to study firsthand the world of Moses, as well as that of much of the Old Testament. The result was that rather than interpreting the Old Testament in its context, most people read the scriptures in light of what they saw in their daily lives. If you were a Christian living in the antebellum American South, it's likely that every reference to slavery that you saw in the Old Testament would make you think of the black chattel slavery you saw in your community. The method is as follows. The Bible sanctions quote-unquote slavery. My state practices slavery. Therefore, anyone saying my state can't practice slavery is being unbiblical. Southern pulpits regularly appealed to this to justify their pro-slavery stance to their constituents.
The procedure, which by 1860 had been repeated countless times, was uncomplicated. First, open the scriptures and read, say at Leviticus 25:45, or even better, at 1 Corinthians 7:20-21. Second, decide for yourself what these passages mean. Don't wait for a bishop, or a king, or a president, or a meddling Yankee to tell you what the passage means, but decide for yourself. Third, if anyone tries to convince you that you are not interpreting such passages in the natural, commonsensical, ordinary meaning of the words, look hard at what such a one believes with respect to other biblical doctrines. If you find in what he or she says about such doctrines the least hint of unorthodoxy, as inevitably you will, then you may rest assured that you are being asked to give up not only the plain meaning of Scripture, but also the entire trust in the Bible that made the country into such a great Christian civilization.
A closer examination of the Scriptures reveals that this pro-slavery fear-mongering was a gross form of eisegesis.
One of the strongest indications of the prevailing racism of the mid-19th century was that Bible expositors could not get Americans to take as seriously what Scripture said about the color of biblical slaves as what it said about slavery itself.
John G. Fee, an anti-slavery minister in Kentucky during the 1840s, gave the following argument.
Let us grant, John Fee supposed, that the New Testament never condemned the enslavement by Rome of those it conquered in Germany, Gaul, Spain, Greece, Egypt, and so forth. What, he asked, was the complexion of these nations? His answer was that most were as white or whiter than the Romans themselves. Consequently, if in general the apostles' teaching and practice sanctioned slavery, it sanctioned the slavery of the age, the slavery amongst which the apostles moved. This slavery was white slavery. The large portion of those enslaved were as white, and many of them whiter, than their masters.
There is absolutely no biblical support for the notion that one race of man can legally enslave another solely on the basis of their skin color or ethnic heritage. The pro-slavery mind of the antebellum American South could not understand this fundamental difference between what was going on in their communities from what is described in Scripture. The simple observation that white people in the American South were exempt from chattel status, regardless of any other economic factors, proves this. The unbiblical nature of American slavery is further compounded by one of the most infamous laws enacted by the federal government, the Fugitive Slave Act. This law was passed first in 1793 and reaffirmed in the Compromise of 1850. Whereas the practice of slavery was being treated as a matter of individual states' rights, this act made it a federal mandate for escaped slaves in free territories to be returned to their masters. Further, it mandated the cooperation of all citizens in the return of runaway slaves, even if those citizens themselves lived in free states or were personally opposed to slavery.
Commissioners or their agents could summon any local posse or bystander, and all good citizens are hereby commanded to aid and assist in the prompt and efficient execution of this law whenever their services may be required. This meant that no one, no matter their beliefs or conscience, not even an abolitionist, could escape the service and deference to the slave power without stiff penalties. Not only were local and state governments forbidden from intervening, but the new federal slave-tracking police force could enlist you in the business of slave recovery against your will.
The plain statement of the Scriptures on the matter of escaped slaves is this, quote, "You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him." The Fugitive Slave Act was one of the grossest violations of biblical authority produced by the slavery system. Still, pro-slavery exegetes were not without their attempts to try navigating around what the Scriptures say.
To suppose that Moses could so formally authorize and define slavery among the Hebrews, and then enact that every slave might gain his liberty by merely stepping over the brook or imaginary line which separated the little cantons of the tribes from each other, or even by going to the next house of his master's neighbors, and claiming protection whenever petulance or caprice or laziness should move him thereto. This is absurd. It is trivial child's play. It takes away with one hand what it professed to give with the other. The fact that slavery continued to exist from age to age is proof enough that the Hebrews did not put the abolitionist construction on the law.
The fault in Dabney's argument is that it misses the obvious inference that the slave is fleeing from his or her master because of the master's tyranny and abuse. There are two applications which can be derived from Deuteronomy. Number one, a foreign slave fleeing into Israel for refuge, and 2, a domestic slave already within Israel fleeing to another family or group. In both instances, the presumption of Deuteronomy is that the slave was a victim of illegal treatment. First and foremost, as we have seen already, America's slaves were ultimately the product of kidnapping, a crime punishable by death in the Torah. Further, the Torah also gives account for how slaves are to be treated. Quote, "If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth." Slaves in the antebellum South were subject to both of these types of injustices. They were first kidnapped from their homes in Africa, and they were even kidnapped on American soil. They were also subject to inhumane treatment and abuse at their master's whims. Any of these factors would have been grounds for a slave to legally flee to a safe haven under biblical law. If the pro-slavery states were attempting in the least to stand on scriptural authority, they would have recognized these crimes, and the fugitive slave laws would have never even been considered. Again, this is akin to the bondage the Israelites themselves experienced at the hands of the Egyptians, the bondage which God repeatedly exhorts Israel to abstain from. Quote, "You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there.